Welcome to session 5 of Archaeology in the Bible. Today we'll be talking about the time of the judges and also the kingdom. And when I'm speaking of the kingdom, we're going to talk about the United Monarchy of Saul, David, and Solomon, and probably just the very early stages of the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. On a side note, I did kind of poll some of the folks in the class, and we will extend the sessions out we will have a session number 9 and 10. Those will cover the excavation at Tel El Hammam and the possibilities of that being the biblical city of Sodom. And then session 10 will be a deeper discussion of the synchronisms of the Exodus with Egypt. So we will have a few extra sessions on hand. So as we've done the past few sessions, let's talk a little bit about pottery comparisons. We had a few questions of people asking how you can really how different the different or how different the pottery styles were from era to era, how hard it is to tell if you're dealing with a different era in the stratigraphy. So again, we see this is the late Bronze age form for a cooking pot, and you'll notice here that you have these rims that are everted. They are sticking kind of out. That really pronounced everted rim is a hallmark of the late Bronze Age. If you look at the Iron Age, you see that the rims really start to turn inwards, going from being everted to inverted. And this is really a hallmark of the Iron Age. Also, we talked about jars in the past. So our late bronze jars are a little bit more angular, a little taller and thinner than the middle bronze ones were. In the Iron Age, we see that they start to fill out again. This is what's called a collar rim jar, and you can see that based on how the neck really looks. The rim is really on a shorter neck than you see on many of the late bronze styles. And also you find that it's much more full. In many cases in the Iron Age, you were moving larger and larger types of goods. So these jars started to get pretty big, sometimes as much as 5 or 6 feet. And at that point they would be called pithoi. So we transition from pottery to the what we're actually here to talk about. And as we've done in some of the previous sessions, we start off with some of the problems that may be problems of the text, that may be problems that have been brought up by various critics. We will at least take a look at them, whether we can explain them or not. And a common criticism that we get throughout various eras of biblical accounts is a criticism of documentation. Really, what we have here in the time of the judges and in the time of the United Monarchy, really beyond the biblical text itself, we have little to no documentation of this time frame. So why is that? Well, in the time of the judges, let's bear in mind that there was really no central authority in Israel. There was no king, no central ruler. It was a bunch of tribes that sometimes cooperated and sometimes didn't. And what we see throughout the book of Judges is periodically when things would go badly, a judge would be raised. These judges were regional. In many cases, they might only lead a single tribe or a couple of tribes that are allied together. Very seldom did you see anything that united the entire strength of the Israelites. And without that kind of central authority and that planning and urbanization, You're not going to get any monumental inscriptions. You're not going to get any large scale architecture that is left for you to find with archaeology. The other thing you have to realize is with this, won't even say loose collection of tribes, there's not really a central government to deal with outside powers. So you're not going to have records from any of the surrounding nations of treaties and things like that. And two, the societies in the area that keep really good records, that would generally be the Egyptians and the various Mesopotamian powers, really don't have a lot to do with this region of Canaan in this time frame of about 1200 to 1000. Egypt has pulled back from Canaan. They've got their own problems to deal with, and the Mesopotamians really haven't come that far west yet. It's going to be probably another 100 years or so before you really start to see the Assyrians and the Babylonians taking an active interest in the Levant. Now, the United Monarchy, that being starting off with King Saul, there's a bit of a hole in the documentation for this. We really haven't found any inscriptions of these kings like we do for some of the later kings of Israel and Judah. Now, we do find some structures and architecture that indicate that there's a development of a more urban type area. The cities and the towns are getting a little bit bigger. But we really don't see anything that says I'm King David or I'm King Solomon, like we do in some of the later time frames. Now, the other thing is we do see from the architecture a lot of similarities. Now, in 1 Kings 9:15, there's a statement of the fact that Solomon rebuilt the cities of Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. And what we have found, again, not a slam dunk, but at least somewhat of a synchronism, is each of those cities has a very similar gate structure. It's a six-chambered gate structure for the main city gate. So there are some things that tend to support that, but it's certainly not a slam dunk. And as is the case, there's great argument over just how old some of those gate structures are. Do they come from the time of Solomon? Are they earlier? Are they later? So forth. Now, we did say there was a general hole in the accounts of this time, and that's true. There's a hole, not just a hole that doesn't say Saul, David, or Solomon. It's a hole that doesn't say anything. So it's not so much that there is conflicting information or conflicting data. There's no data at all. And so this really kind of leads the minimalists to really reject the idea of an identity for Israel at this point, even and really they're not willing to own up to there being such a thing as Israel until you get to that point of the divided kingdoms where it's much better documented and there's a lot more sources. So along with documentation, we also have the problem of settlements, and really settlements both Canaanite and Israelite. As we mentioned in the previous session, the expectation of many scholars is that the quote unquote conquest from the biblical account should have laid waste to all of Canaan. Now, we did mention that in the biblical account, it actually only tells of three cities that were destroyed. So maybe not as widespread damage as we might think. But the problem really lies in that scholars and critics would say that they expect to see different kind of settlements. You know, they would expect to see Canaanite settlements and they would expect to see Israelite settlements and be able to tell the difference between them. And so that's somewhat of a problem in terms of the expectation. So what can we say to this? Well, sometimes it's best to go right into into the scriptural account. So in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 10 and 11, Moses is telling the people, and when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob to give you, with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of all good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant. So the Bible is telling us in this story that maybe the reason why we don't see separate Israelite and Canaanite settlements is because the Israelites moved into the Canaanite settlements and kind of took over the houses and took over the agriculture and everything else. So from that perspective, you wouldn't expect to see a whole lot in terms of the archaeology if different people moved into the same house and kept using the same stuff. There's little that you would see in the material culture that would tell you there was much of a change there. And the biblical accounts also would indicate that that Israel adopted a large number of Canaanite practices, specifically religious practices, which the Bible speaks out against very strongly. So that just makes it even more likely that it would be very difficult to distinguish them from their neighbors if they're living in the same kind of houses and they are worshiping the same kind of gods. Again, if you study the book of Judges, you see there's a continuing cycle of sin and apostasy that is really brought on by the worship of the Israelites of the Canaanite gods. So, to quote one of my professors, the Israelites were probably only faithful to Yahweh for a grand total of about 12 to 15 minutes in the entire book of Judges. So it was a constant up and down type thing. So and really, if we look at it in that perspective, the Israelite culture would have been much more primitive than the Canaanite culture. So it would be very natural to expect them to kind of imitate the ways and adopt the objects and the culture of this more advanced society. So let's move from problems to synchronisms. And remember, our synchronisms are kind of points in parallel histories that sort of cross over. So some things in outside history that kind of line up with some things from the Bible. So first, let's talk about the Merneptah Stela. This is the earliest known reference to Israel outside of the biblical text itself. So what is this? The Merneptah Stela is a victory monument that was found in Egypt. It's a monument for an Egyptian pharaoh named Merneptah. It's dated to about 1200 BC or so, which would put it right in the time of the Judges. It was discovered in 1896 by our good friend Richard Flinders Petrie. If you'll recall, Petrie was the one who excavated in the Levant and discovered the tell concept. The monument itself refers to a victory over Israel. Of particular notice, if you look in this highlighted area down here that has been blown up, you see it says, Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more. Now, this is kind of the hyperbolic sort of language that you see in any sort of a Egyptian victory type monument. But one thing that's quite interesting here, if this is especially if this is from the time of the Judges, the Egyptian wording in this indicates that when it refers to Israel, it sees Israel as a people, and the Egyptians kind of looked at this as if you were a nation, they called you a nation, but if you were kind of just a group or a tribe or so forth, they would refer to you in a different fashion. And so what we see here is around the time of 1200, the Egyptians know about Israel, but they don't consider them to be a nation, and that kind of lines up reasonably well with what we see from the book of Judges as well. So we talked a little bit about some of the problems and the whole from the United Monarchy. Um, the lack of documentation has caused some scholars to really doubt the historicity of pretty much any of the events from the United Monarchy. So you'll hear them say, well, David and Solomon were just mythical figures, weren't real people. So what we have here is the Teldan Stela in 1993. This fragment was discovered in Teldan, which is in the northern part of Israel. It was discovered as part of a wall that was built to reinforce the area of Dan against the Assyrians, and that would have been probably in the middle 8th century or so. This was a common type occurrence where you would have stonework from a previous time frame that would be repurposed, reutilized in later buildings. So you have to be kind of careful about how you date some of these stone inscriptions. But this was found as part of a much later construction. However, the writing style has been dated to about the 9th century BC, so maybe around 850 BC or so. What we know from this is the inscription is in Aramaic. It appears to be a part of a victory monument from the Arameans. Not only is it written in Aramaic, it also appeals to some of the Aramaean gods. The inscription itself celebrates the deaths of Jehoram, who was king of Israel, and Ahaziah, who was king of Judah. And we look in 2 Kings 9:24-27, we see that particular event mentioned in Scripture. Now, that's all well and good, but why are we so excited about this? Just other than that it mentions a particular conflict. What makes this so interesting is in the reference to Ahaziah, it refers to him, or it talks about him being of the house of David, and that's what you see highlighted here in the lighter color. Ben David is so house of David. And so that's the first time that David is really mentioned outside of the Bible. And it's a time frame that the time of Ahaziah would have been within 100 years of David's death. And a lot of the scholars will tell you if it takes at least 100 to 200 years to kind of work up a myth on something. So that took a little bit of the steam out of the criticism here. But what we find, and remember, we talked about people getting hypercritical in a previous session. As soon as this was found and published, a lot of these minimalist scholars who have really invested a lot in saying these things are mythical immediately accuse the excavators of fraud with really no evidence to it. So you have to be conscious of this. You can't just tell people they're dishonest because you disagree with what they're saying and what they're doing. We do have another bit of an artifact, and we talked about this in one of the earlier sessions, called the Mesha Stela, which was from the Moabite king Mesha, and it also refers to the house of David. So we have two kind of extra biblical references to David. Now let's talk about Sargon II, who was a king of Assyria. Sargon was the Assyrian king who conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and deported its people. So this is where that term or where that concept of the lost tribes of Israel comes from. At one point in time, he was only known due to the mention of his name in Isaiah chapter 20, verse 1. And so, again, it was widely doubted that he was an actual historical ruler and individual. However, in 1843, French archaeologist Paul-Émile Botta was excavating in Mesopotamia, and he was excavating in this one site and just wasn't getting any results, and was kind of disappointed. So he decided he was going to move. And funny enough, the site he was on that he wasn't getting good results from ended up being the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, and was a huge archaeological find. But he's not the one who made it. But he moved to the village of Khorsabad, which is in modern day Iraq, and he eventually uncovered Dur Shahrukh, which was Sargon II's capital. He had moved the capital from Nineveh, and he being Bota, actually found the palace and the archives. So there was an extremely large quantity of cuneiform tablets that he found. Now, the most iconic find from Khorsabad was these Lamassu statues that are pictured here, a mythical creature, and you can find at least one of these in the Louvre now. Let's also talk about the Broad Wall of Hezekiah. As an engineer, I'm always struck by when the Bible talks about various construction projects. The book of Nehemiah is particularly interesting, but we also have the Broad Wall of Hezekiah. The Assyrians, we already know that Sargon destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. The Assyrians were the superpower of the ancient Near East in the 9th and 8th century BC. They were basically unstoppable militarily, and everyone was trying to take measures to protect themselves, and that included Judah and its king Hezekiah. And so, what do we see from this? Well, the biblical reference comes from Isaiah chapter 22, verses 9 and 10. And you saw that the breaches of the city of David were many. You collected the waters of the lower pool, and you counted the houses of Jerusalem, and you broke down the houses to fortify the wall. So the biblical account tells us that in order to make the wall bigger, that Hezekiah actually had houses broken down, houses demolished, to use the materials to make the wall bigger and stronger. So in the 1970s, a portion of the Broad Wall was unearthed in Jerusalem. What you can tell from looking at it, comparing it to other portions of the wall in Jerusalem and at other locations, it shows signs of having been fairly hastily built. And we find several examples where it runs right through the foundations of houses. So that would tend to point out to you that some of those houses were probably dismantled in order to build up the wall. Now, again, we talked about the Assyrians being the superpower of the day, and people had good cause to fear the Assyrians. They were a great military power, and they were known for their aggressiveness and their cruelty. So what we have here is the Lachish relief. This was a series of engravings on the wall of the Assyrian king's palace that showed the siege and the taking of Lachish in 701 BC. Lachish was the second largest city in Judah, and it was one of the protecting cities on the road up to Jerusalem. These reliefs were discovered in the excavation of Nineveh between 1847 and 1851 by Austin Henry Layard. They show incredible detail of how the Assyrians besieged a city, how they conducted military operations, and there's a lot that we've learned from their techniques and their methodologies just from studying the figures that are shown on this relief. Also, interestingly enough, the relief shows an earthen ramp, a siege ramp that was built to allow the Syrians to get higher up on the wall and get their get some of their siege equipment, their battering rams and so forth up to the point of the wall through the ditches and so forth. Archaeologists have actually found that siege ramp at the site of Lachish. So a nice little confirmation of this particular relief. Also, the reliefs show numerous scenes of impalement and beheadings that really show that the Assyrians did a lot to live up to the reputation that they have of cruelty. Now, we also have Taylor's Prism, which is the Chronicle of Sennacherib, who was the king of Assyria. It specifically speaks about Sennacherib's campaign into Judah. It was discovered by a Colonel Taylor, hence the name Taylor's Prism, in 1830. On the prism itself, Sennacherib records that Hezekiah refused to pay the tribute that he was owed as a client state to the Assyrians, and so therefore the Assyrians invaded, and they captured 46 fortified cities, one of those being Lachish, and it kind of gives you a lot of detail here. Now, this parallels accounts in the Book of Kings, Chronicles, and also Isaiah. Isaiah also tells us that the Assyrians came right up to the walls of Jerusalem, but they did not conquer it or take the city. And what we see in the account from Sennacherib in his annals, uh, nowhere does it say that he conquered Jerusalem either. In fact, the interesting turn of phrase he makes is that he closed up Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. So one would assume that if he had conquered Jerusalem, he would have taken credit for it. So it seems again to be some level of support and verification for that aspect of the biblical account. So let's move from the synchronisms to some cultural specificities, some just little pieces of maybe everyday life or culture that tend to support some biblical aspects. One and this one's kind of fun. Smiting with the edge of the sword. That's smite is always a good King James version word there, but we find that that's a popular phrase, and really until well into the Iron Age, and even a little bit after that. But most swords were curved, as shown here in our photograph. So you would this looks to be an Egyptian khopesh. So you would have these curved swords, which made them slashing type weapons. So when you would use the sword, you would strike with the edge of it or smite with the edge of the sword. And really only much later, when they perfected the techniques and started to use a little more iron, which was much more durable, did they start to make straight swords that got a lot more usage as a thrusting weapon. So once this became the case, you see that phrase with the edge of the sword really fell out of common usage. So an interesting little cultural aspect to that. Let's talk a little bit about iron and the Philistines. Now, we've talked about the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, so forth. And so it's easy for us to think that, okay, in the Bronze Age, everybody had stuff made out of bronze. And in the Iron Age, everybody had stuff made out of iron. But that's not really the case. And in many cases, uh, for a goodly portion of the Bronze Age, nobody had anything made of bronze. They knew what bronze was, but it was so expensive to make that, maybe the king had some bronze stuff, but that was about it. Same was the case with iron. So, in terms of iron and the Philistines in the time of the judges, we have from 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 19 and 20, it tells us, "Now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears, but every one of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, or his sickle." So we have some examples of some actual iron artifacts from about this time frame, about the 1200 to 1000 BC perspective. So you can see here, you have some various. This is basically a farm implement, probably a pick or a mattock. But you also have some weaponry here. You've got an axe head and a couple of spearheads. This depending on the size, this might have been an arrowhead. So what we do find, the passage doesn't mention iron itself, but we know that the Israelites were using bronze up to that point. So one would assume that that the problem of not having the blacksmiths would have dealt with iron. Another thing is the archaeology tends to bear this out. The archaeological finds from this time period show lots of iron weapons coming from the Philistine settlements. But when you go into settlements that have more of an Israelite or a Canaanite uh, perspective, you find only farm tools. If you find anything iron at all, it's going to be a farm tool. So that seems to bear out this passage in 1 Samuel. So let's not leave this just yet. Let's talk about the PIM. So in the King James and Authorized versions, so long ago, the very next verse from the passage we just talked about with the blacksmiths, the very next verse mentions an unknown word called PIM. And so the translators had no earthly idea what a PIM was. And so as the verse had a lot to do with sharpening or sharpening metal objects, they just assumed, well, it must have something to do with metalworking. So we're going to assume that a PIM is a file. And so for a few hundred years at least, this was the preferred translation. However, later archaeology showed that a pim was a measure of weight. You see here, this is a little stone weight, and the inscription on it actually is pim. And not only was it a measure of weight, that was also how they did currency. You would have an equivalent weight of silver that was used in a monetary transaction. So now that we know this, and a PIM, I believe, was about a third of a shekel in weight. So now in the current translations, this verse reads, "And the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares and for the mattocks, and a third of a shekel for sharpening the axes and for setting the goads. So on the day of the battle, there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people with Saul and Jonathan, but Saul and Jonathan his son had them." All right, let's stick with weaponry here just a little bit and talk about the slaying. Now, from the time of many of us, if we have heard the story of David and Goliath, it's very much of a thing, that we associate with a slingshot, and we really do David a disservice if we are equating his sling with a slingshot. So we look here at this graphic in the usage of a sling, and some of these sling stones would have been about the size of an apple or so. The sling was a weapon of war and defense that went beyond just the ancient times. It was used even up until the Middle Ages in terms of siege and everything else. Now, the maximum for a skilled slinger, the maximum accurate range, and this is to hit someone in the head, is about 40 yards, and the maximum effective range just to get to a specific area would be somewhere around 100 yards. Let's put this into perspective. We know that Goliath had a spear and a sword and a javelin. And that spear wouldn't really have been the type of spear that you would have thrown, but the javelin would have been. But about the best you could do with throwing a javelin would have been about 20 yards. So it's quite likely that with his sling, David was able to strike Goliath long before Goliath ever would have had a chance to strike back at him. So slings are still a thing. They were used in war even as late as the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, and even more recently than that. You can see in some of the news reports that Palestinian protesters have used them against the Israeli army even up until the modern day. Now let's finish off with the Ketef Hinnom tablets. The Ketef Hinnom tablets are the oldest known written scripture. They've been dated to about the 7th century BC, which, remember when we talked about our documentary hypothesis and people saying that the scriptures probably weren't written until about 400 500 BC. This kind of puts a little bit of a monkey wrench into that. They were found in 1979 just outside of Israel in a tomb excavation. So this is what it looks like here. They were very small, thin silver sheets that had been etched with the lettering, and then they were rolled up into really tight little cylinders. Um, so again, this is noteworthy because it shows that Scripture existed at least 200 or 300 years before a lot of scholars would like to admit to. Now, the passage itself is the priestly blessing from Numbers chapter 6. May the Lord bless you and keep you or guard you. May the Lord make his face shed light upon you, shine upon you, and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his face unto you and give you peace. So this is a very noteworthy thing, and as these things go, a fairly recent find in the late 1970s. So that finishes us up for this session. We will pick up next session and talk about the fall of Judah, the exile with the Babylonians, and then the return to Jerusalem thanks to the Persians. So again, let's talk about our references. We have a few new references here. We have Giving Goliath His Due, New Archaeological Light on the Philistines. This is again it's academic, but it reads pretty easily. So if you have an interest in the Philistines, this is a very good book for the layman. I found it pretty easy to read. So that was definitely a plus for me. We still have our old friend Kenneth Kitchen, and he really has the gold standard on the Old Testament there. But then another text that's worth checking out is Warfare in the Old Testament by Boyd Sievers. It has a lot of good information, but it's also written. He has certain sections where he writes kind of in a narrative or in a story from different time periods of the Old Testament, where he'll actually tell a story from a particular person's perspective. So it's a much more enjoyable read than most of these more academic type books.